Karl, I thought if you'd take us back to about 1,000 years, maybe a little bit longer. You can correct us on the dates. And I think around what is now northern India, right? And so we know many people are quite, familiar with the scholarly tradition of Buddhism back then, with the great universities of Nalanda and the scholars and the textual tradition that came out of that. But also at this time, there was these wandering yogis. And so I want you to tell us a little bit about this tradition that was like the Siddha tradition, or however it's described. Could you tell us a little bit about who these people were?
Yeah, it was actually as diverse as you can imagine. People were from all kinds of different backgrounds. Actually, quite a bunch of them was, you could call, academic or establishment dropouts. Because Saraha was a very famous Brahmin before, learned in the Vedas and everything. And also as a Buddhist, he already had a reputation. And then he dropped out and went to the jungle. Like the same goes for Maitripa, Naropa, many of those, Tilopa. And then others were, seemingly very normal people who had jobs, like shoemakers, farmers. One favorite job is, for the female ones, is alcohol maker, like distiller, having a little brewery. And they then usually received instructions based on their work, like mahamudra instructions based on their work. So the things they were doing and the implements, they then were used as symbolic tools, expressions, to actually work with their mind while they did their physical work. And so there was also kings and princesses and pretty much anybody you can imagine. So it's a very mixed crowd, actually. So it's not just wandering yogis necessarily. I mean, in the end, they all became that more or less, but some even then returned to, you could say, the establishment, such as Maitripa. He went back to the university because Shavaripa, his teacher, had told him to go back and teach all those scholars what Buddhism is really about in terms of recognizing the nature of the mind.
There's an interesting point that, for Maitripa to go back to the university to tell all the great scholars what Buddhism was really about says something, right? And it's this distinction between an experiential approach to the practice and versus an intellectual approach. Do you think that's fair, that these yogis were primarily interested in the experiential approach to the nature of the mind?
Yeah, definitely. But still, I mean, in a lot of those songs, many of them, they knew their stuff. I mean, they also knew a lot of the technicalities from the tantras, like, the 4 Abhisheka practices and everything that's related to that. So many of them were very well educated, actually. But as the story of, Naropa shows, he was, basically challenged by this lady coming up to him and asking him, do you understand the words that you're reading there of your text? And he said, yes. And then she asked him, do you understand the meaning? And just to please her, he also said yes. And then she started having a fit. Said, oh, no, you don't understand it. You should talk to my brother, Tilopa.
Yeah, and this shows that, and this wasn't just your average dropout, Naropa, right? He was quite even maybe an abbot, possibly.
Yeah. He was. So, yeah, the crowd is very mixed.
Yeah, a mixed crowd. This is interesting, right? So great scholars and also people who, I guess the lingua franca of Buddhism of the day in literary was Sanskrit, right? So, but possibly many of these people who were practicing in this tradition wouldn't have known Sanskrit. I think you mentioned that to me earlier.
Yeah, they would not. I mean, unless they were, traditionally educated Brahmins or something like that, or already in a Buddhist university, then they wouldn't know Sanskrit. And their audience wouldn't know Sanskrit either. So that means most of those songs actually were not sang in Sanskrit. They were sung in some Middle Indic dialect, whichever one it was, depending on where they came from and what their audience was. And then later they were written down but a lot of times they were also not written down in Sanskrit, but in some form of Upper Brahma, which is a more written Middle Indic language, similar to Pali.
Mm. So they were these songs were sung originally in the most natural, maybe the most natural tongue of the yogi who was experienced realization. Maybe we can say that.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure, there was a lot of slang words in there too.
Mm.
Sometimes you can even see those still in the translation in Tibetan.
The language of the people, the common people in a way, right?
Yep.
But also you mentioned that some of these yogis were very well trained in tantric practice. And so you see that tantric technology and language coming through in the Dohās as well. And this was a question I wanted to ask you. So nowadays we talk about different types of mahamudra, right? We talk about essence mahamudra, tantric mahamudra, sutra mahamudra. And so how do you define, like you might think that these songs represent an earlier or proto-essence mahamudra tradition, but there's a lot of tantric, themes in there. So how do you think about this tradition in terms of those three categories of mahamudra?
Well, I mean, this classification of these three types of Mahamudra is actually very late. And it's, from all we know, it's clearly Tibetan. It seems that probably it has originated either with Chaman Kongtrul the Great or somebody in his circles, because it doesn't really show up before that. And then when it comes to the songs of the Mahasiddhas, yes, many of them clearly show knowledge of the four Abhisheka process and the related practices. So they are very clearly Tantric Mahamudra. But then, and others, they do not mention any of that. They're just very pithy mind instructions, like formless, totally non-elaborate. And some, they combine these two. So I would say, and then of course you have other texts which are not necessarily Dohas, but some of them are in that area, like Maitripa, he blended actually Madhyamaka and Mahamudra. So he has some, sutra element in definitely some of his texts, blending it with essence Mahamudra if you want.
Yes.
And there's also other texts in the collection of the Seventh Karmapa that actually equate Prajnaparamita with Mahamudra.
Yep.
And also, say that through Shamatha and Vipassana of the Prajnaparamita, if they are enhanced by the Guru's pith instruction, you can realize the nature of the mind. Like you don't have to go through the full-on four Abhisheka tantric path.
Yeah, this is an interesting point, is that, the shamatha, Vipassana gradual approach, but if it's sort of like enhanced by the Guru's blessing and instructions, then it sort of elevates this sort of practice to almost to the tantric level, maybe outside of the tantric level. Is that fair to say something like that?
Yeah, I mean, Gampopa is well known for his approach of teaching what is later called Sutra Mahamudra, like pointing out instructions not in a Vajrayana context or in a Tantra context. But it seems that something like that happened in India definitely too, because there are these scriptural witnesses that pretty much give the same approach. So it seems it was not that uncommon. It's not an invention by Gampopa or something. And there's also some texts by Atisha actually that have come to light recently that have a very similar approach, actually. Like using sutra elements and then blending that with Mahamudra instructions.
So what would that look like? What does that look like in terms of what would an instruction like that?
Well, it can be very simple, like depending on how much previous meditation experience people have.
Yeah.
Like, or what their training is. Like, you start with just basic shamatha with an object, like Milarepa taught the shepherd boy.
Yeah.
And then as you do that, then the person comes back, reports their experiences, and then based on that, the master gives more pointing out instructions in terms of, okay, now look at that state of mind when your mind is resting. What is that like?
Yeah.
Then look at the state of mind when out of that resting a thought arises. What is that like? Like, what is the essence of that?
Yeah. and that would, stand in for someone's spiritual progress, just like an abhisheka, the 4 abhishekas would, is considered in the Indian tradition. They would accept something like that as well. Back in, when we're now 1,000 years ago in northern India, and it seems to me there's a whole different types of situations that you might be encountering in terms of spiritual progress. One more heavily tantric, one more heavily what we might consider essence mahamudra, just introducing people directly and nakedly into the nature of the mind. And then you're even saying that it seems to be around this time a more gradual approach as well, where people are being asked to rest in some type of shamatha, and then look at the mind and be introduced through some sort of mengak of the guru. So all these are happening at once, it seems, during this time. Is that your feeling?
That's exactly what it looks like, yes. So I think also, the element of like guru devotion and guru yoga is of course very crucial in both Vajrayana and Mahamudra. And that seems to be one of the key elements, like guru yoga, trust in the guru, and pointing out instructions. With those 2 elements, then you can kind of, if you so want, upgrade more sutric material into a more immediate approach that is very close to essence Mahamudra.